Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I thought today we could go back and revisit some of my favorite music of the year. As you guys are aware, we're almost at the end of 2025, and I think it's definitely been a calmer year for music than 2024, which definitely had some of my favorite albums. But I wanted to do a little bit of a recap, and I thought a great way to start this would be going through some of my favorite albums of the year. Now, like I mentioned last year, I feel like there were a lot more standout albums to me, specifically as someone who is super into pop. I had a lot to work with, and this year definitely branched out into different genres. I think that's very shown through Grammy nominations. I think being very centered around R&B and hip hop specifically, but I still think there are a lot of really great albums to reflect on this year. Now, this year was a little bit weird for me because I don't think some of the albums that are in my favorites I would have thought would be in my favorites, and conversely, some of the ones that didn't make it up there, I think January Me would have hypothesized would be a standout track for me in the year. So while there were albums like Life of a Showgirl and Man's Best Friend that I did really enjoy certain tracks on, I don't think they made it into any of my all-time great albums. However, there were definitely a couple albums this year that made it in, and I was thinking I'd do a video on each of them, kind of breaking them apart and why I think they stand out in the landscape of 2025. I think analyzing albums is very different from songs because you're not just analyzing the songs within the albums, but you're also talking about what's the theme? Is the theme delivered clearly? Is there new perspectives in this album that we haven't quite heard before? For example, So Close to What is definitely an album I might want to talk about, but I think one of its flaws is that it approaches certain topics in a way that I feel has been done before and is a little bit saturated. Again, the conversation around fame I think is a very interesting one, and I think there are certain songs on it that do it really well, and then I think there are some that might be a little bit repetitive and could have been worded better. I absolutely love Purple Lace Bra, and I don't want to give it any hate, but I do think the narrative story there is a little bit overdone. Again, despite that, absolutely love the song. Please do not take this as I hate Tate McRae. Just a little bit of what I'd love to see from her is a little more creative perspective on that argument, for example. So when I'm talking about a really great album, we're talking about the themes are delivered clearly. We're talking about the themes are delivered in a somewhat unique fashion. There's good writing. There are standout tracks for sure. But we're talking about the overall body of work. Again, when I talk about Life of a Showgirl, I absolutely love songs like Father Figure and stuff like that, but I don't think the entire theme of the album was necessarily tied together as well as some of the albums I want to talk about in terms of this year. And what better way to start out with, I think, what was probably my favorite album of the year, and it's kind of crazy to even call it that. If you guys have read the title of this video, you probably already know what it is. It is Ego Death at the Bachelorette Party by Hayley Williams. Now, if you told me this was going to be my favorite album of the year, back in January, I would have totally told you you were a liar. Hayley Williams, to me, was the face of Paramore, a band that I was familiar with, but not super into as a kid, and only really came to love them a little bit more in high school, honestly, in hindsight, after a lot of their big hits have been dropped. I knew Ain't It Fun, it was all over my radio stations, driving as a kid, but Paramore was a little bit before my time, before I was interested in music, and it really didn't pop up to me too much until high school, and even then, a lot of their hits were outdated, so to say. I graduated high school in 2022, for perspective on that. So I definitely knew who Hayley Williams was. Obviously, she opened for the Eras Tour. I'm a massive Swiftie, so I knew that. I am familiar with Paramore, but I had never listened to any of her solo stuff. It never got a ton of traction, I feel. And so this really came out of left field for me this year, but I'm so glad it did. And to put this also in perspective for you, my album of the year last year was probably Torture Poets Department. It's a coin toss between that and Hit Me Hard and Soft, but this album very much feels like Tortured Poets 2025 with quite a few other elements, but the themes and the writing feel very similar to me, and so does that cohesive string throughout the album. I think Torture Poets did a really good job of having productional elements that make it feel like a cohesive body of work, and so does Ego Death. So, again, if you don't know, Hayley Williams is the face of Paramore, and she recently came out with a solo work. She, I believe, has 2 other solo albums that, once again, didn't gain a ton of traction, and I believe this started as a promo for her hair dye company. I'm not 100% sure on the backstory on this album, but I believe it is, if you buy some of my hair care stuff, you unlock some of these secret singles, which makes sense to me because when this initially came out, when I started listening to it, it was actually dropped as 18 different singles in her catalog. It wasn't even an album, but the cover photos for each single were very easy to piece together that it was kind of supposed to be a cohesive body of work. They were all these black and white photos of Hayley with certain gold elements worked into them. And when I first started listening, again, I was very surprised. The first song I heard, and probably one of my favorite songs on the entire album, was Ice in My OJ. I find that one to be such an earworm, and I think it sets a really great tone for what to expect for the album. We get a little bit of raw Hayley, I think, in the second verse. In that first verse, upon doing more research, I realized it was kind of a callback to her time, I believe, voicing a cartoon character and one of the first songs she had released ever. So, and she didn't release it, I don't think, but it seems to me that that line was supposed to be a callback to the very beginning of her career. So I feel like this song kind of tells us a little bit about Hayley as a solo performer and is kind of talking us through where she started and where she is now. And I really love that infectious like part of the chorus where she's like screaming, "I'm in a band." There's so many ways to interpret that. Is the band like a jail for you? Are you trying to exude to people like, "I'm in a band, like you guys don't understand, like I'm really cool and amazing"? And I think that vibe, I only get that when I tie this together with like the title track of this album when she's talking about how she's the biggest star in this racist country singers bar. So that I definitely think there are themes of ego, on the album, as the name would suggest. So Ice in My OJ is definitely one of my favorite songs on the album productionally. I think it's so interesting. I think it's very rock alt, and I don't know, it just struck a note with me for sure. I love, one of my favorite Taylor albums is Reputation, so as you could imagine, this is kind of the type of song I really enjoy, is that angsty, rock inspired song. So despite that being one of my favorite songs on the album, it's definitely, I think, objectively not amongst the most compelling and interesting songs on the album. Don't get me wrong, again, it's one of the only ones that made it into my Spotify Wrapped because this was re-released so many times with new songs added on in the end and stuff like that. But this one fortunately made it into my Spotify Wrapped. I found the overarching themes of this album to be sort of like female rage and also grappling with identity issues in so many different ways, and also grief and coping and mental health issues. And I think these are all really tied together pretty beautifully. On first glance, it might not feel like there's a super big theme throughout, but when you dig deeper, again, I think identity comes up in a lot of different concepts. Like a song like True Believer, you might not think is super about identity, but when you dig deeper into it and realize it's actually about grappling with your family's past. And that's a really interesting song. And she talks more in different songs throughout this album about her family's past in different perspectives. Maybe it's not talking about grappling with the past of a very Southern, very Christian family and what that's like, but she also talks about how her mother and her mother's mother have been in these cyclical abusive relationships and coping with that kind of aspect of her identity. And also in Love Me Different, one of my absolute favorite songs in the album, grappling with parts of her identity when she realizes that not only was her partner not treating her well, but she's also not treating herself well and expecting that treatment to come from external validation when really intrinsically she needs to change how she's dealing with herself, because if someone's going to love her different, it's going to have to be her. Even if other people come in, they will ultimately end up leaving if she does not respect herself and love herself in that fashion. So I think identity is very clearly the main string throughout this album, and I think that manifests itself in different ways. Again, I talked about mental health dynamics. I think a very obvious song for this is Mirtazapine, and it does connect to your identity in the sense of grappling with how to cope with certain ailments and how it is very normalized in this day and age to go on certain antidepressants or SSRIs. I'm not super familiar with mirtazapine and what it does, but in the song she talks about it being her magic genie in a bottle, and I think that is her talking about like, yes, this is helpful, but I have begun using it not as something to kind of supplement my life, but more as a crutch. Like, I am not using it to add on and enhance my quality of life. I'm using it to crutch on as my quality of life. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. The song is a super great. It's up for a Grammy, I believe, for rock song, and it's definitely one of the rockiest songs on the album. Really great electric guitar going on there. Kind of very Paramore-esque, I think, that song specifically. And so that's definitely one that I really enjoyed. I want to touch a little bit more on Love Me Different as well, because this is one of the most relationship-centric songs on the album. Again, we get songs on the album that kind of explore her family's past with relationships and stuff like that. But I find Love Me Different to not only be one of the most relationship-centric songs on the album, but also one of the turning points on the album, because she has this moment in the middle of it where she realizes that I need someone to love me different. That's all she's saying through the first two verses, the first two choruses. And then she's talking about, I am scrolling up until 3 a.m. I am, going through endless hours of therapy and nothing's changing. And perhaps the one who needs to love me different needs to start with me. And I really love this kind of change in the tone, because it makes the third chorus hit a lot harder and honestly feel much more like a natural conclusion to my ex-partner is probably out there saying, like, no one's gonna love you like I did. And first of all, hope not. First of all, I hope not. And second of all, someone is. And I know that concretely, because that person is going to be me. And I think that is such a beautiful turning point throughout the album, because again, we're really struggling with identity issues here, and this feels like her coming to terms with, like, I am going to be the one who loves me for me and not for who I portray myself as, not who kind of my ego manifests myself as, but for who I am and how I interact with people. And I'm going to do that by treating myself well, by actually putting an effort with my relationship with myself. And so I find that to be an absolutely beautiful song. I'd also love to touch, again, I mentioned this one, but an absolute standout track, True Believer, is such a well done song. It's super creepy. It's got a very Halloween vibe to it. And it's all kind of about dealing with the past that comes with being someone from the South. Hayley Williams is someone who's been very open about her upbringing in Christianity. When I talked about her referencing her first song ever released, that was for, I believe, a Christian cartoon. And so she's been very open about that, and this is her reflecting on the past baggage that her family carries around, and her community, moreover, carries around in Southern America as a Christian family, and how it can be very easy to ignore what has happened. And she talks about in the chorus how I'm actually the true believer for seeing through this, and for, not necessarily feeling guilty for it, but also acknowledging it and understanding it and thinking about it, and hopefully learning from that situation, besides trying to erase what has potentially happened or pretend like there aren't issues with the current system of things happening. When she talks about something being built under the biggest bridges, it's like fences or something. I'm like blanking on the lyric, that's really embarrassing, but she's kind of referencing how, like, there are still a lot of issues with this, and instead of learning from the mistakes we've made in the past, we are kind of letting it manifest itself in a more modern perspective. And I am the true believer for believing in the ghosts of the past and believing this has all happened, and also trying to learn from it. So I think that is an absolutely beautifully done song. Touching on another absolute standout track, Glum. We're again talking about identity here, as we are throughout this album, and this one we're delving into similar areas as mirtazapine. We're kind of talking about mental health issues, but instead mirtazapine, I think, puts this really interesting spin on it. And again, it's a little more rocky, a little more upbeat. Glum, actually, when you dig apart the lyrics, is really devastating. It's almost like a crisis moment for her, feeling like she can only reflect the light of other people. Again, in the wake of your sunshine, I've never felt so glum. Think I'm made out of moonlight. Don't reach quite as far, but I still show up. I mean, so eloquent, such a beautiful way to describe trying your absolute best to be there and say, I will be there, but I might not be able to be there, like, mentally the way that you can, the way that it seems other people are. And perhaps that is because I am struggling with issues that you guys aren't having going on, right? Perhaps why she is on mirtazapine. Again, I don't know exactly. I'm just kind of trying to piece together the story here, so bear with me. But specifically when we get to the bridge, I think it's an absolutely devastating bridge for this song. On my way to 37 years, I do not know if I'll ever know what in the living I'm doing here. Does anyone know if this is normal? And again, we can also break down the chorus. Do you ever feel so alone that you could implode and no one would know? And when you look around and nobody's home, don't you want to go back to wherever we're from, wherever we're from? Again, I think this song is absolutely heartbreaking when you break it apart. And I do think the production supports that message, but it does gloss it over a little bit. And I remember reading this for the first time and I was like, wow, that is really, really deep and really upsetting. And I think especially that last part of the chorus, do you ever want to go back from where we're from, initially made me kind of reflect back on True Believer. Like, is she talking about regressing in that way and going back to where she came from? Or is she really talking about a much deeper topic, go back to where we're from, in the sense of feeling as though your life is completely irrelevant or something similar to that? So, dealing with very heavy themes on this song. And it's just so beautifully written. I think it's very eloquent. I think it really articulates what Hayley's attempting to show through the song, and that meaning of almost meaninglessness. And, juxtapose that with a song like the title track where she's talking about how she's the biggest star. She's absolutely amazing. She's in a band, Ice and My OJ. So I think this album does a really good job as well of playing with the idea of ego and how ego can often be used as a shield to protect someone, or protect someone's kind of public perception from what it actually feels like, which can, if you feel you're so meaningless, perhaps you will portray this absolutely super confident person to people to almost overshow what a normal person would show, and how ego can often be someone screaming for help in like a weird way. Overall, again, I think this is an absolute masterful album. I think the writing on this album is unique and precise and eye-opening, and I think there's easy to see themes and threads throughout this entire album. On top of all of that, I think the production is infectious. I think there's so many standout tracks that you can listen to when you're on a car ride and stuff, and there are so many tracks where you can really dig in and find yourself in it and find comfort in them. Parachute, which was a single released after the album was released, became extremely popular on TikTok, which I think goes to show this album has a lot of layers of, like, it does have a lot of deep cuts, but it also has certain songs that have that infectious production and lyricism that people resonate with, and that gets popular and mainstream. So overall, that is why I think this album is absolutely one of the greats from 2025. I think it's definitely going into my playbook of greatest albums that have come out while I've been alive, or that I've witnessed the drop of, and I've been listening to it all year. Again, the only reason it wasn't on my Wrapped is because she released it so many times, and I was listening to the singles for so long. But that is about all I have for this video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Did you love this album? Did you hate this album? What do you think of Hayley Williams? I would love to hear your guys' opinions on that, and any of your guys' 2025 albums of the year. I'm hoping to release a couple more of these videos, going through maybe a couple more albums that I find particularly interesting from this year, and maybe a couple songs. So let me know what you guys think about that. But anyway, hope you all have an amazing holidays, and I'll see you in the next video.